if you aren't taking crawling efficiency as a big part of your strategy, then you're potentially going to miss out. You're going to make the search engine crawlers and the LLM crawlers work harder to find your good content, and they're going to be rewarding websites that are making it easier to find that content. So if you're not using your scheduled crawls, working with your development teams and your tech teams to make your website as efficient and easily crawlable as possible, then you're going to be falling behind the competition in 2026. I'm James McLoughlin, and this is SEO in 2026 Additional Insights.
James, what's your number one SEO tip for 2026?
Efficient crawling and indexing management has to be a cornerstone of your SEO strategy in 2026. So that's ensuring that crawlers, both the traditional search engine crawlers and the crawlers from the large language model tools, can quickly and easily discover, understand, and index any content that you want surfaced in the search engines or the LLMs.
Okay, so what does crawling and indexing management mean in practice in 2026?
So it's basically making sure that anything that you want to appear is technically crawlable. So no disallow rules, no server-side restrictions on what crawlers can access, that your links are crawlable, so proper HTML links, not JavaScript buttons or any other uncrawlable elements, making sure that your important URLs are clearly prioritized, your non-relevant ones are excluded from crawling as far as possible, and that you've got your indexing signals and directives properly set up so you're telling search engines what you want to appear in the index and what you don't want to appear. And this is absolutely essential because you can't appear in the search engine's index, or you can't be part of the LLM's training data if the crawlers can't find, crawl, index, and effectively understand your content.
It sounds like it could be a full-time job almost to do that. I mean, how much, if you're just a single SEO working in an organization, how much time should you spend on crawling and indexing management?
It needs to be part of your regular workflows. So it's something that you can monitor and action when you see red flags come up. So it definitely can be a full-time job, especially with big organizations that have hundreds of thousands or even millions of URLs. But it's something that we can at least monitor and jump on when we see a problem through mainly through regular scheduled crawls. So if we have a baseline for how many URLs we'd expect the crawlers to be able to discover on a normal crawl of our website, and we have a baseline of how many URLs from that crawl should be indexable to the search engines. If we see any significant fluctuation in that numbers, so if we all of a sudden see a big increase in the number of discovered URLs in a crawl, or if we see a big change in the number of indexable URLs in a crawl, we can react to that and we can try to diagnose the issue, create tickets, ask developers to fix it, do whatever needs to be done. But yeah, keeping an eye on that data, keeping an eye on that crawl data, that indexing data, as long as that's part of your regular workflows, you can kind of, assuming that you don't have any huge problems already on the website, as long as you're at a good place, you can keep an eye on that, and you can kind of monitor that through regular crawling and just make changes to that strategy if red flags pop up from your regular crawls, from your crawl data.
So what does regular workflow actually mean? Does it mean every day, every week, a couple of hours here and there?
I would say you need to have your weekly crawl set up. Now, if you've got an absolutely huge website, that might not be practical. If you've got a website with millions of URLs, it can sometimes take days for that crawl to run. So as long as you've got a sample crawl or a portion crawl that a lot of the modern cloud crawlers allow you to do, you can crawl a subsection of your website and get a flavor of what's happening in your website from a portion. But you need to have some kind of, I'd say weekly, if not weekly, monthly crawl running, just so you can see the fluctuations in your crawled and indexed URL data.
And any particular software that you favor using at the moment for this?
I usually use Screaming Frog and Botify, but there's most of the cloud crawlers, pretty much all of the cloud crawlers will allow scheduling.
Got you. Okay. And Screaming Frog versus Botify, would you use one over the other depending on the size of the site?
Botify is usually good for, or any of the cloud crawlers usually better for large websites, just because they do run cloud-based, so they're not going to affect your website. If you use Screaming Frog for an absolutely massive crawl, it's going to start slowing down your laptop significantly, and you're not going to be able to do much in the background. So definitely, if you're running big crawls, you want to be using tools like Botify or whatever cloud crawler it might be. The other big benefit of them is that they have a lot of these alerts built into them, so you'll be able to see from the kind of headline stats from your crawl what big changes there's been in terms of discovered URLs, indexed URLs, changes in status codes, things like that.
So that's what tools to use and how often to use them. But how do you ensure that crawlers can quickly and easily discover and understand and index any content that you want to be surfaced?
You've just got to make sure that there's no technical blockers that would prevent crawlers from accessing your content. So no stray disallow rules in your robots.txt file. Your links are crawlable. You've got to make sure that as much content as possible is visible in the source HTML. And that's particularly important with the advent of LLMs. A lot of the LLMs and the answer engines have bots that aren't as sophisticated as Googlebot and can't process a lot of JavaScript content the extent which Google and Google crawlers can. So you need to make sure that any of your kind of SEO and index relevant content is discoverable in the source HTML, just so that it's visible for any plain HTML crawlers that are visiting your website. In terms of indexing, you've just got to make sure that all of your indexing signals and directives are properly set up. So you're only allowing indexing of content that you'd want a user to be able to find via the search engines. And not, on the flip side, it's not just about making sure that Google can crawl and access the stuff that you want them to crawl and index. You also need to make sure that you're preventing crawling of anything that is not useful for the search engines to crawl, not relevant for users to land on via the search engines. For example, I worked with a publishing client who had a ton of product reviews on their websites, and on each of the websites they had a page where you could apply filters to find the kind of relevant reviews that you want. So you could filter for the type of product, the star rating, certain other characteristics. And they had a robots.txt rule that was blocking crawling of these filter URLs. And the links to the filters were also removed in the kind of the rendered version of the page. But the links to these faceted navigation, these filtering URLs, they were still present in the source HTML and only removed at rendering. And the disallow rule in the robots.txt file had been sort of malformed. It wasn't written correctly. So Googlebot was crawling hundreds of thousands of these kind of effectively low value, low quality URLs that just had different lists of product reviews with different filters applied. And if Googlebot can access that kind of content, you're wasting crawl budget on URLs that have absolutely no value for SEO and that you don't need Googlebot to be crawling. It's just using and wasting time that Googlebot could be spending crawling your good quality content, your articles, your product reviews, stuff like that. So if you're not checking this stuff regularly, and if you aren't making that kind of crawling and indexing management a focal part of your SEO strategy, you really run the risk of situations like that where you're just wasting crawl budget on low quality URLs, or you've got thin content or duplicate content popping up in the index, and that's going to cause big problems for your overall SEO strategy further down the line.
So if you find a significant issue like the one you highlighted there, what's a significant quick fix that you could actually do to prevent this from happening quickly?
With this one, because Google had discovered so many of these URLs and indexed a bunch of them, before we could apply the correct robots.txt rule, we first had to no index all of these pages to wait for them to drop out of the index, and then we could reapply the robots.txt rule correctly so Google would stop crawling them. But when you're using your crawling tools, you've got to be looking out for stuff like this, URLs that are appearing in your crawl that don't look like they have SEO value, and that will help you identify these issues. And then, it's just working with the development teams or whoever it is who has control over the robots.txt file to make sure that your robots.txt files are correctly applied. And you can use tools like technicalseo.com has a robots.txt tester that you can test and apply robots.txt rules to, and check that anything that you do apply is actually going to work and block what you want it to block before you put it into live. And that'll give you the sort of peace of mind that when you do put that rule to prod in your robots.txt file, it's actually going to do what you want it to do. It's going to do what you want it to do.
Okay, so that's handling the content that you don't want to be discovered, surfaced. How do you actually define the content that you do want to be surfaced, and how do you How do you make it more likely for it to be surfaced?
There's a few things. So as I mentioned before about the kind of links between content, if you're using links that are reliant on rendering or kind of JavaScript buttons, that's going to make it more difficult or even make it impossible for crawlers, depending on the crawler, to discover the content that's linked to. So making sure that your links are proper HTML links and that they're discovered in the source HTML is going to make it easier for crawlers to find your content. Also, just making sure that stuff isn't buried too deep in the website. So anything that takes the crawler a long time and has to sort of go down a lot of different levels to discover that content, it's going to be less likely to be discovered quickly. So making sure that there isn't too big a kind of crawl depth to any content that you want search engine crawlers to be able to find and index. And also just making sure that this is where this kind of crawling and indexing management and efficiency comes into it. If you're wasting your crawl budget on low value URLs, it makes it less likely that search engines will find the stuff that you want them to crawl, because they'll have spent, a significant amount of time crawling low value and kind of low quality, thin content. Link graph matches between mobile and desktop. So I've worked on sites in the past where they'll have a bigger navigation for desktop because users obviously have a bigger screen and they can see more links. And then some of those links will be removed in the mobile version because they're dynamically serving two sets of code to mobile user agents and desktop user agents. But because generally the crawlers are using a mobile user agent, they're not going to see any links that are only found in your desktop version. So just making sure that any links to content that you want the search engines to find are included in the mobile version of your page and not just in the desktop version of the page is also really important. And I've seen that quite a few times where link will be removed from the mobile version of the page, and that effectively makes that link invisible to the search engines.
So what are the main differences between crawling and indexing for traditional search engines versus LLMs?
The big one is that a lot of the crawl activity from LLM crawlers is not rendering JavaScript. So any content that you have that relies on JavaScript rendering to be able to discover that content, that will be either not discovered by the LLMs or it won't be discovered as quickly. So this is why I say anything that you want to be able to appear in AI overviews or any of the large language model search results, that has to be in your source HTML. They just aren't as sophisticated as Google when it comes to crawling JavaScript content. So that's the big one. And this is also why you also need to make sure that your kind of crawling strategy is efficient. If you're asking the LLM crawlers to crawl stuff that just isn't relevant for their training data, so if you're asking them to crawl sorting and filtering URLs, if they're crawling duplicate parameter pages, things like that, it's making them work harder to discover the stuff that's actually useful for their training data. So you need to be excluding or hiding as far as possible any of this kind of non-crawling relevant stuff from not just the classic search engine crawlers, but also the LLMs crawlers.
Okay, and finally, I'm thinking about crawling and indexing in terms of how that feeds into a content marketing strategy. So how do you take insight from what you discover with your crawling and indexing analysis and assist with determining what your content strategy should be for the coming few months?
So crawling and indexing, the crawling can help with that because your crawler will help you identify potential gaps in your content. So if you've crawled your website and there are certain topics that hasn't been discovered by the crawler, that can do two things. First of all, if that content does exist somewhere on your website, but the crawler hasn't found it, that's a big problem for your content strategy, because if you have a page that covers that topic, but it's not discoverable for crawlers, then it's probably going to rank worse than if it was linked internally and discoverable, or maybe not at all. Or, if that topic doesn't exist, then that means that's a topic that you need to be writing about, you need to include in your content strategy. So the crawling of your website can also help you with things like that. And the tools like Screaming Frog, they have now that they've allowed you to link your crawler with OpenAI or any of the Gemini or any of the other LLMs. You can use the crawler to identify internal linking opportunities, potential content opportunities. It can identify where you've got two pages that are semantically already quite similar. So if you have a couple of pages that are potentially competing and potentially about the same topic, you know that your content strategy doesn't necessarily need to include a page that covers that topic because you've already got a couple of pages about that topic. Actually, you should be looking to consolidate the similar content and create one page that's about that topic that is your kind of your primary canonical page about that topic and can rank for whatever the searches that the users are making around that topic. So ensuring that you've got a good kind of oversight of your content, and you're using the crawlers to kind of identify the entire kind of graph of your website. It's really important for informing your content strategy, to making sure that you're writing content about the topics that are important to users and the topics that you haven't got content about already.
James, what's the key takeaway from the tip you shared today?
If you aren't taking crawling efficiency as a big part of your strategy, then you're potentially going to miss out. You're going to make the search engine crawlers and the LLM crawlers work harder to find your good content, and they're going to be rewarding websites that are making it easier to find that content. So if you're not using your scheduled crawls, working with your development teams and your tech teams to make your website as efficient and easily crawlable as possible, then you're going to be falling behind the competition in 2026.
James McLoughlin is a technical SEO specialist at EE. Find out more over at ee.co.uk. James, thanks so much for being part of SEO in 2026.
Thanks, David.
I've been your host, David Bain. Get your copy of SEO in 2026, the book, over at SEOin2026.com.